1934, the year Colonel Wilson and friends attached a snakehead to a toy sub and photographed irrefutable proof of the Loch Ness Monster. Airplanes were only used for war and mail, with some fleets boasting a fatality rate as low as 20%. 1934, penicillin wouldn't be available for another 20 years, and if you asked for toilet paper, they'd hand you yesterday's newspaper, and not as a joke. Try that with an iPad. This movie was old when old was young. Old as dirt, and probably every original reel has by now deteriorated to dirt. March of the Wooden Soldiers, better known as Babes in Toyland. Before watching this, I had never seen any version of Babes in Toyland before. In fact, for years, I thought it was just The Nutcracker under a different name, which was another movie I never saw until recently. But now I know they are distinct stories, though they have similar histories, and both are frequently remade. This is the first filmed version of this story, which began its life on a stage. However, if I am reading history correctly, it is thanks to the Disney version from the 60s that it became a staple of the holiday season. This one, too, was originally released for the holidays in 1934, when the late Leonard Cohen was about 2 months old, although it doesn't actually take place at Christmas time, but the story revolves around one of Santa's toy factories, so it gets a pass. This 2012 conversion from Legend 3D is based on an earlier restored and colorized version of the movie Legend had done in 2006. This 3D Blu-ray does not include that version. In fact, the 3D edition has no extras, aside from a colorful 3D menu, but the 2D edition can be bought separately for completists. This was one of 3 stereo conversions of old public domain movies Legend produced Blu-rays for in 2012. Variety Films has an excellent video explaining some of the history of these Blu-rays and the uncertain public domain status of this movie in particular. Link is in the description. As a side note, there is an 80s remake starring a young Keanu Reeves and Drew Barrymore that's also had issues with copyright, and as a result, only a heavily edited version remains available, legally. Now, this conversion I would describe as a bit understated, but quite good for what it does do. It's much more impressive when you consider the year it was done, 2012, and the fact that they could not have expected much of a return on this project. I wonder if it was done at least in part as a demonstration reel, or perhaps they hoped it would be an evergreen disc that would sell a little every year forever. But for me, this 3D color world is appreciated as an invitation into the deep past. And what do we find? I found it's impressive that they managed to convert through the frame flickers and various film distortions. The tracking there is impeccable. Despite being in 3D, it retains the feel of watching old film, only with the benefit of having the various distortions match in each eye. Normally, these kind of problems are the death of 3D and were a plague on pre-digital stereo film. The credits show a massive conversion team worked on this. In the present day, it makes for an excellent comparison to one of the recent AI projects put out by iPop, although iPop does reach out and grab you more. A lot more. This does have cleaner crop lines and heavily preserves minute wisps of hair and clothing fabric that really help sell the illusion as genuine. So far as I could tell, the stereo here never significantly comes out. It's entirely looking into the screen. Although enjoyable, there is plenty of detail left behind. Some backgrounds leave counters and props flat, and in many scenes, the disparity appears to be at most a few pixels, making it best viewed on a larger screen. Still, it's enjoyable. The setting works in favor of the conversion. This is Toyland, which is something of a proto-Shrek universe, inhabited by characters from a variety of fairy tales, so lots of toy-inspired stuff, which tends to be blocky, and that shows up well in 3D. You see this demonstrated in the opening credits, which also give us some still impressive old-school special effects of moving pictures inside a book, which is a lot of fun to see converted and given some depth, creating a sense of a magic window. From a creative standpoint, the conversion team would have been fully justified in leaving those pages flat. It is a book, after all, not a portal. But I am happy they took the liberty, as it's one of the more interesting 3D moments in this movie. There's a scene where we have some translucent ghost creatures. Maybe they were fairies. There seems to be zero attempt to maintain any illusion of transparency, at least in the stereo realm. The background bulges out to the shape of the little people, yet it still works in its own way. The bulging background could be interpreted as simple light distortion. The caves, for me, were the most interesting 3D locations. It usually has some kind of rock or stalactites in the foreground, giving the whole thing a pleasant pop-up book framing. Actually, I suppose the whole movie has a pop-up book feel. It never really is deep enough to make it feel like its own world, with perhaps an exception for when the wooden soldiers get involved. The stereo does very well to show them all lined up and in formation. I don't know if it is deeper in these scenes, but it feels deeper. Probably the colorization has more effect on the story than the 3D conversion. The heart of the story is a tale of escalating wrongs, each party going to greater lengths until one side gets buried in the consequences of their actions. Before 3D conversions, back all the way in the 90s, colorization of old movies was all the rage and a hot topic of debate amongst film buffs and professional reviewers. A main point of discussion was these movies were created as a black and white product. They chose to dress the set with things that looked good on black and white film. Adding color, accurate or not, misrepresents those intentions. The biggest example of this is they used green face makeup because it showed up better than red. So even if you have an algorithm that can correctly guess what the original color was, you're going to end up with a ghastly result, forcing the project into creative decisions. Therefore, colorization of a Hollywood film cannot be considered restoration of something that was lost, but a reimagining of it. And this movie could stand as a small example of how that might twist things. You see, I couldn't help but notice the bad guy often turns green, especially in the later half of this movie. It happens to work. It suits the end, and it sort of shouts out that he's basically gone feral with rage at that point in the film. And at first glance, that may seem fine. He was the bad guy. But if I were writing a moral lesson, and they probably were not, but let's say they were, then as a director, you'd want to communicate that you, the audience, are always one or two decisions from being that bad guy. Don't do as he does. Don't be him. But if the bad guy is seen as something akin to a green goblin, he becomes dehumanized. Then the audience can be assured that his outcome is predestined, and there's no fear of ever being like him. He was just born bad, like a wild animal, and the lesson is lost. Still, you have to consider these movies were never meant to be society's cornerstone. They were spectacles meant to live in a moment. So injecting some of the modern version of spectacle to liven it up is probably going to be appropriate most of the time. And besides, we don't live in the society that wrote this film, so even with the best preserved original copy, it's never going to be completely understood. Time itself is a derivative work.